Hello, hello. Okay. So I think there was some voice issue. Now it is fine. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'll just give maybe a minute for you to settle down. How many of you had seen the first introductory lecture? People who have joined in. We are now going to continue with the second chapter, that is freedom. We are taking it step by step, okay, one chapter at a time, so that you have sufficient time to understand the chapter also, right? Okay, hello. Yeah, now I think we should define the audio as well. Audio issue in between. Now it should be sorted. Okay, fine. So hi everybody. We're continuing with our NCERT series on polity, right? And it is very important to build our base when we are doing polity here. That is the main idea. And we're going to cover two NCERTs that I've told you. The very first NCERT that we are doing is political theory. An NCERT which is very important, but again sometimes ignored in the exam. And second NCERT after we are done with this one is going to be Indian Constitution at Work, right? Now, if you recall in the very first class that we had yesterday, we had discussed what is politics, right? Why is it important? What is political theory? Hello, hello, hello. Again, I think there's some voice disturbance. I'm sorry about that. Okay, I'll just tell you again what I was saying. We were continuing two NCERTs. One was NCERT political theory, and one would be Indian Constitution at Work. The previous class we had done one chapter, very important chapter. That chapter was the basic introduction to political theory. Okay. Now, in that chapter, again, in case somebody is watching this for the very first time, I would want you to recap. This lecture is for absolute beginners. If you're wanting to start your preparation for 2027 or beyond, these lectures are there for you. First, we'll make a very simple base with the NCERT, and then in our foundation classes, we'll go one step beyond. We will cover what is relevant for mains and what is relevant also for prelims. Okay, that is the idea here, right? So, what is politics? We had seen in the previous class. What is political theory? Why study political theory? Fine. Now, today, a very important question for all of us. What does freedom mean to you? Right? The chapter 2 of this NCERT talks about what is freedom, right? And in this chapter itself, you will today understand a very important concept. What is the distinction between positive and negative freedom? Okay? And in case you're wondering what is positive, so freedom is freedom. What is positive about it? What is negative? This is a very important philosophical distinction and equally relevant for UPSC prelims, right? If you're somebody who has done this in your political science optional, of course, the PSR optional, we do this in far more detail. But for general studies, even this concept is important and has been tested in the PYQs if you see your paper, right? So we'll limit our discussion. Okay. Again, a very good morning, Mithun. Okay. Again, other people who have joined in. Okay. Very good morning to all of you. Right. Now, the very first question that we have to think for ourselves, what exactly is freedom? Right? Freedom is something that has been fought for. We have the Indian national movement, the Indian freedom movement, and not just India, around South Asia, of course, Africa. There have been so many movements for freedom, which is why this NCERT, the very first page, has the image of a very important leader. Okay. In your GS classes, you'll also read more about him. Even in ethics case study, you will read about him. But I'm just introducing the name in case somebody is still not aware. Nelson Mandela. Okay, he was also inspired a lot by Mahatma Gandhi. and he played a very important role, okay, in the freedom movement of South Africa, right? I'm just telling you one keyword here that you should remember. He played a very instrumental role in the anti-apartheid struggle. And for some of you, this term maybe you're seeing for the very first time, right? Apartheid. Apartheid was a policy in South Africa for racial discrimination, right? The blacks would be treated differently, and let's say the non-blacks would be treated differently. Nelson Mandela found this to be very discriminatory. He raised a lot of voice. He voiced that people should ultimately be free. Why have differential treatment, at least? Why racial segregation or racial discrimination? And for his anti-apartheid struggle, he was jailed, not just for a few days or months, but for years at end. There was a very, very prolonged movement for civil rights, for liberty, for freedom, right? So this person becomes very important for us, right? In again, like I've told you in your GS, as you will do history, as you will do world history, etc., you'll again read about him. But even in the NCERT, we get a glimpse of him, right? Second person, again also mentioned in this chapter, Mahatma Gandhi, okay? Right? Now, from the polity perspective, we're not going into the detail of what is the overall contribution. Although in GS1, if you look at, there was a very wonderful question asked sometime back in your UPSC mains. And that question said, what would Indian national movement have been if Mahatma Gandhi would have not been a part of it, right? And this is a very different way of asking you. For example, somebody could have asked you a question, what is Mahatma Gandhi's contribution in the Indian national movement? A different way to ask you is that how Indian freedom movement would have been if Mahatma Gandhi would have not been a part of it. Just imagine, okay? So which also we need to know all the contributions, of course, you will in history, a lot of detail. Mahatma Gandhi, his role, okay, we have seen non-cooperation movement, okay, different Kheda Satyagraha, Champaran Satyagraha, right? And later on, of course, you have, like I told you, non-cooperation movement, then even Quit India movement, and then whole consolidation. The whole crux and the core part was what? Freedom. Freedom from, in both these cases, the freedom from the rule of outsiders. Freedom from British rule in the Indian context. But generally, that is the definition of freedom that you know. That freedom is, you're not governed by somebody outside. But is that the real definition? And this is again where political theory becomes very important. Political theory tells us all these basic, simple, foundational concepts. What freedom really means, what it means to be really free, okay? So, having this question, I've made the use of two thinkers, right? Nelson Mandela as well as M.K. Gandhi. Now, we will go one step beyond, okay? And just keep this question in your mind, what is freedom? Does freedom mean the ability to do whatever you want, right? Normally, you will say, yes, sir, there should be freedom. But the point is, let's say you want to go in a road, you have a car, you're driving at 70 kilometers per hour, right? Immediately you see a lot of crowd. Now you have to stop, otherwise there'll be injury, right? So this statement, ability to do whatever you want, can never be absolute, right? You have to take into account the rule of the law and order. You have to take into account other people also. For example, if there are 10 people and everybody says, I am free to do whatever I want, don't you think there will be chaos? So that simply means our definition of freedom, while should allow others to do whatever they want, but it cannot be absolute. If it is absolute, there is going to be dispute. Okay? For example, if I say I want unlimited property, then you will say, no, sir, this area belongs to me. I want this property should be mine. Somebody else will say, no, I have a clearance from the government. I can set up a tower here, etc., etc. And it is not just the property or the resource allocation. It is also freedom of speech, right? For example, some time back, you would have heard about the latent controversy that is again related to almost a very dark humor kind of comedy show. People saying that we have a freedom of speech, but does it include whatever you want to say? Or there is also a line that has to be drawn. If whatever I say it becomes defamatory, if it becomes overtly vulgar, if it does not align with decency, public order, morality. So the point I'm trying to make here is, whenever I think of freedom, right, somebody can say freedom means no restrictions, very basic understanding. Somebody can say do whatever you want. Do whatever you want, okay? Or somebody can simply say, no, freedom for me means independence. Although the term independence can be multifold. For example, independence can be political. The examples I gave you, freedom from British rule, that is political independence. Freedom or independence can also be economic, right? For example, if we are only wearing imported jeans or maybe shirts, trousers, whatever, we are not making them, but we are simply buying it from outside. Are we truly independent? Not really. So here, that is why we also talk about economic independence, economic self-reliance, Atmanirbharta. That can also be a part of independence, yes or no? Yes or no? So the point is, the word independence also has a contextual meaning. That is again something that we have to understand here. I hope we are clear on this part. So when I'm saying, and this is a very simple way to understand, right? So what if you see this? The question is, how do we define freedom? Right? It cannot be absolute, although this is a very simple way to understand what is freedom. Okay? Now, normally speaking, I'll just write a simple definition of freedom. I'll just open the note. Oh, it is here, just right. So when I'm saying freedom, and this is a definition you can write alongside me, with me, you can write this, and we'll see how to define freedom. Okay? So when I'm saying freedom, I can simply say it is the ability to act. The freedom is the ability to act see, till here you will agree with me. Okay? What is freedom? Freedom, we are saying, is ability to act, think and express. But I just gave you examples. Whatever we speak, what if somebody makes slogans against India? Somebody will say absolute vile things. Would you allow that? The point is, freedom to act, think and express without unnecessary restrictions. There can be restrictions, but they should not be unnecessary. Now, to understand this, let's imagine an individual. And think of a government. Okay? In our later classes, I'll also tell you the difference between these two terms. What is a state and what is a government? But simply think of the government. Let's say this is your government. And this relation you have to understand. Individual will want maximum freedom, yes or no? Right? Why would anybody want that? You cannot do anything, you cannot go out of the house, you cannot go to a mall, you cannot attend a concert of your choice. Okay? You're not allowed to eat whatever you want. The point is, individual will want maximum freedom. I hope you agree on this. And the role of the government or the state, they would want to facilitate it, but at the same time also have to ensure law and order. And this relation is very important to understand. Okay? In countries like USA, the people will have maximum freedom. Role of the state is to ensure people have maximum freedom. So they should not have any unnecessary restrictions. Right? Now, in India, we also allow the maximum freedom, but there can be some criticism. Sometimes we have prolonged internet shutdowns. Right? Why is there an internet shutdown? Simply because the government would feel that if the internet is not shut down, the chances in that particular area, they may get more disturbed, right? But in other countries, let's say like Russia, okay, or maybe certain countries in Middle East, people have very less freedom. Why? Because state can put a lot of restrictions. right? So what are we saying? What is freedom? Freedom is the ability to act, think, and express without unnecessary constraints or unnecessary restrictions. That is one definition. Okay. Second thing which I also want to say. Now, let's say there are two people. Let's say person A, person B. Right? On paper, which means theoretically speaking, and let's say both of them are born in India. Okay. Both of them can go to a very good college. They can have good schooling on paper, I'm saying, theoretically speaking, which means both of them can ultimately go to, let's say if they want to go to a law institute, let's say any of the NLUs or any IITs, IIMs, they can do so, right? But what is the issue? Do they really have that choice, right? Which means this choice, the freedom, is also dependent on their social circumstances plus the support of the state. Now I'm giving a new dimension to our discussion on freedom. Till now, what I was saying, you're free to express, do anything. Now, think of the social realities, right? Let's say, now we'll make it the example more simpler. Let's say person number A is from a very privileged background, okay? Has had very good schooling, okay? All the coaching, books, whatever was there was available to him. Now the chances of A getting selected versus let's say B from a poor household, does not have resources, has all the constraints, who is more likely, okay, to, for example, clear exam? You will say, sir, it is going to be A. Who has then more freedom, right? So when I made you understand independence, I told you political, I told you economic, but there is also a social, or I can say socio-economic independence, right? Which means your background will also play an important role. Therefore, in this social circumstances, so in some cases, you know that the government also provides support, okay? Some cases can be reservation, okay? Maybe the fees can be waived off, etc., so that there can be freedom for B as well. Notice how this is a new dimension of freedom, right? So generally we think of freedom only as the ability to think, but the point is freedom can be more meaningful. In our later classes, I'll also tell you about Amartya Sen. Even in economics, you read about Amartya Sen. And for Amartya Sen, right, you can just mention somewhere for him, and this is something that will stay with you because I've given you this example. Development is freedom. Now just imagine this. And let's focus on this from a very practical level, right? All of you at least would have seen 21 years of your life, right? From the very start, right? When I'm saying development is freedom, now think about it. Think about somebody living in the most remote part of India. They've not had any development, right? If they've not had development, the infrastructure is going to be weak, right? Poor educational outcomes, let's say educational infrastructure, poor social outcomes, health infrastructure will be weak. So chances for the people will be less, yes or no? But if somebody is living in a metro city, urban city, very good schooling can be there, okay? Good transport mechanisms, more options, more avenues, more jobs being created, which is why you also think that why people move from rural areas to urban areas, mostly because of better employment opportunities. But we can also link the same thing to freedom. When I'm saying development is freedom, this is also one more dimension of freedom. And why am I telling to you these dimensions? Because in our NCERT, there is a mention of positive as well as negative freedom. Before I explain to you, it is important for me to tell you that independence or freedom is not just political, it is not just economic, it also has a social dimension. Okay, till here, are you able to follow? Anybody in the comment section can just let. Yes, Aman, that was the question, that if we didn't have Mahatma Gandhi, that was the main question. What would the Indian national movement or the freedom movement have been? Okay, it is a more reflective and an imaginative question. If you're able to think of any points, please write that in the comment. Okay, now I hope you have seen this example. So one definition of freedom you have written with me is this: ability to act, think without. This is a good definition, not bad. But A more realistic definition is also what you can write with me, right? That freedom is meaningful. Freedom is meaningful only when people have real opportunities. Only when people have real opportunities to choose. Now, let me again explain to you this point. When I'm saying real opportunities to choose. Now, on paper, theoretically speaking, these two students could have applied for the same entrance exam, okay? But in reality, real opportunity is again with somebody who has more resources. Here also that means role of the government or the state, don't you think becomes very important? For the people who don't have real freedom, who don't have real opportunities to make a level playing field, right? So again, today, I think one thing that you should definitely understand is the freedom is not just simply saying that I am absolutely independent. Also think of people from the disadvantaged section. Even we are not under a British rule, but do you really think they have all the freedom? And then think that in some tough cases, for example, we know that there is almost 1/4 of the population, right? All, I should say around 1/5 of the population that is living in poverty, would not have all the best of resources. So I'm also connecting that point to the aspect of freedom. Okay, that is the very first point I want to impress on you, right? That is the first part. Now, until now, if we are recapping, we've just tried to see what is freedom, right? Then we have to try to define it, and we've seen two definitions on freedom, right? And we started with two very important historical personalities. One was Nelson Mandela, and the second one was Mahatma Gandhi. With Nelson Mandela, for our class, you'll only remember he played a very important role in the anti-apartheid struggle, right? That is one. Now, a simple question I'll ask, and this is also a heading that is there in the NCERT. The simple question is, why freedom is important? Why is freedom important? Okay, there are some obvious answers which we know, but so we'll see this one by one. Freedom is very important for our self-development. First, I'll write the points and then one by one, I'll explain them. Right? Freedom is important, number one, because it helps in the self-development. Now, you are allowed to act, express, write, all of this, right? And if you're able to do this, act, express, write, so on and so forth, right? It helps you develop your talents also, yes or no? The skill would also be developed in this case, okay? Now here, think of any scientist. Scientists would want to do an experiment, okay? If they're allowed to do so, the self-development would happen, that is great. Think of artists, okay? Think of musicians, think of singers, think of painters. So freedom is very important. Let's say in a very restrictive society where people are not allowed to write their thoughts, okay? So there is no idea exchange, no idea movement. Whereas if you are allowing these ideas to go through, this will lead to, so one is, first of all, the individual gets benefit. Of course, I can even mention businessmen, entrepreneurs. So one is the self-development. You would develop, the individual will develop. Now, if the individual will develop, if a businessman is allowed to freely implement their ideas, they will generate a lot of jobs, they will generate a lot of profit, right? This is ultimately going to benefit the nation, as opposed to where there's a lot of restriction on setting up of businesses, for example, right? So these are very practical basic points. So one is it helps in self-development, right? That is important, okay? It is also very important for human dignity. Now here, think of slaves, think of racial discrimination, Okay, in fact, in India, there was certain, I think you would have heard about certain signs that dogs and Indians are not allowed. Imagine the kind of racial discrimination in some of, let's say, restaurants, etc., during the British rule. Imagine. Okay, the very famous example of Mahatma Gandhi being thrown out of the train, right? So when I'm writing the slaves, or if I'm talking about the discrimination, I have to tell you here two aspects. One is the discrimination which was happening in the foreign rule, but also the discrimination that was happening inside the society. Both these things. If the discrimination is happening, let's say certain people not allowed to go to a temple, this is also discrimination, right? Not allowed to have food and drink together, again discrimination. Yes or no? So when I'm saying discrimination, I'm also saying from outside powers who are ruling us, and even from inside, the social evils being practiced, all of that was against human dignity, right? Again, think of the inhuman practices like sati, right? Let's say after the death of the husband, right, the wife would have to immolate herself, and again through the efforts of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, right, ultimately the practice of sati was abolished. And again, think of sati, how much it is against human dignity, right? What is the idea of human dignity? That every human being should be allowed to exist freely, independently, right? Why should there be a discrimination purely, let's say, based on your race, religion, caste, gender, sex? So freedom is also very important for human dignity, right? Here again, a very practical example, let's have a look at. Okay, if you look at certain countries in the Middle East where there are certain oppressive, regressive practices, as opposed to European countries, let's say even US, where they are very much progressive in nature, they would believe in human dignity. Okay, these are very important words, very important, foundational for the democracy also, right? So one is freedom is important for self-development, yes. Freedom is important for human dignity, absolutely yes, right? In fact, for human dignity, even in India, we had both Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and also Mahatma Gandhi, although their approaches were different, but their objective was to have human dignity, which is also seen in our freedom struggle, and it is also seen in how ultimately the constitution had taken shape, right? So self-development, human dignity. Third thing that is very important is democracy. Okay, what is democracy? Democracy simply means the empowerment of people. In fact, this is a line you can also write. In fact, some of you in your schools or colleges would also read about democracy is for the people, by the people, and of the people, right? That is also something that we understand, right? Empowerment ultimately of the people. So what is the democracy and democratic aspect there? Why is freedom important in a democracy? Because we are saying people are important. People should be allowed the right to vote. People should be allowed to express themselves. So freedom is important in a democracy. And there are countries where you have puppet democracies. Power does not lie with the people. Elections sometimes are just done just for the namesake, right? So this question is also very important for us to answer. Why is freedom important? Freedom is here important for all the three levels. Okay, it is very important in a democracy. Why? Because a democracy cannot exist if the people don't have the right to vote, freedom of speech and expression, what they want to express. Yes or no? If whatever people are saying, it is not allowed, it simply becomes a dysfunctional democracy, a puppet democracy. So freedom is very important even for having strong democratic credentials. I hope that is clear. So what we have seen so far, what basically is freedom? I gave you two definitions of freedom, right? Why freedom is important. Okay. Third thing, which I'll tell you now, this is in fact the most important point of the lecture, right? Is what is your negative freedom and what is positive freedom. If you're able to understand this, you understand the whole chapter. Okay. Many people would only think of freedom in one dimension. We were seeing both the dimensions, negative as well as positive freedom, right? Now let's have a look at it. Okay. When I'm saying negative freedom, right, the freedom is negative here. It simply means, and we'll see this in very simple language, it means we have a freedom from interference, right? Freedom from interference. What it simply means, I am allowed to do things. The state will not take away my rights. That is negative freedom. Okay. Now, to give you example, for example, if there is no censorship, what we are doing, my activity is not going to get censored. That is an example of negative freedom. Okay. For example, if I say no arbitrary arrest, right? That is also an example of negative freedom. Okay. For example, no arbitrary restriction on freedom of speech and expression. Again, please understand, in negative, it simply means there is going to be no interference from my side. That is the aspect of negative freedom. In fact, that first definition of freedom that we had seen today aligns with this one. Ability to act, think, and express. This is generally negative freedom. Okay. And don't think, sir, what is negative freedom? Is this no freedom at all? The point is, in fact, let me explain this to you. Earlier, the action of state was supposed to be or thought to be limiting the freedom of person. If state is taking any action, it is going to limit your freedom. So, negative freedom says that state should limit its action. What would that lead to? Maximum freedom for the individual. I hope you are clear on it. But later on, we saw this definition that not everybody is equal. Some people require at least upliftment, right? So that means if the state is taking actions like, let's say, creation of a hospital, creation of public schools, free education, reservation, that also enlarges freedom. It does not restrict the freedom. This is the crux of negative versus positive freedom. Negative freedom, the concept initially was, if the state is taking action, it may limit my freedom. That is why we say it is a freedom from interference, freedom from unnecessary restrictions. So I am allowed to do whatever I want, as simple as that. That is negative freedom. And please pay attention. Many times people get confused in these concepts, and very important for your understanding. And the second thing is, what is positive freedom then? Positive freedom is simply that actions of the state, like, for example, I gave you examples which help in enlarging the freedom. So if you want to create, okay, an education institute, etc., that is there. So if I were to write what this is, positive freedom means to develop capabilities. Positive freedom is to develop capabilities, first thing. Right? Now, second thing, how can the state develop capabilities here, like the examples I gave you, right? So it can create opportunities for education, health, even reservation, anything of this regard, right? For your reference, I'm just mentioning the name of a scholar here. Just know the name, don't go beyond that. People like T. Green supported the idea of positive freedom, right? Popular scholars like T.H. Green, they gave this concept or the idea, right? Whereas this one, because again, these some of the names are mentioned in the NCERT, so I'm telling you. And for negative, you have John Locke, also mentioned J.S. Mill. Now, in the next slide, also, I'll tell you about J.S. Mill. They are associated with negative. So, in just one simple line, negative freedom, what is it related to? Freedom from interference. You are allowed to do whatever you want, right? Positive freedom is that you are allowing the state to develop the capability of people, because negative freedom assumes everybody is equal, right? But are everybody equal? Not really. Social realities, from which part we start from, our starting points are very different. Where, in which house are you born? Okay, so the state role becomes very important. And if the state simply says that no, we don't, everybody is equal and we don't have any responsibility, that simply means inequality will be reinforced and inequality will be justified. Right? I hope that part is clear. Okay. Now, the last part for today, and this is to understand freedom and social constraints. In our NCERT, you will see a proper paragraph being made, and they have mentioned J.S. Mill's ARM principle, because this is there in the NCERT, mentioned in the NCERT. Again, I'll just explain this to you. Okay, but other than that, don't, people with GS, general studies, don't worry too much about the scholars, that you don't have to cover everything. Whatever is relevant for these scholars will be covered in ethics. Do not worry. If you are students of PSR, in your respective courses, this would have been covered. So for GS, general studies people, don't get worried, because I know this is the only second class. The only reason I'm mentioning these names are because they're mentioned in the NCERT. That's all. Okay. Now, J.S. Mill. J.S. Mill has been one of the biggest. In fact, John Locke, J.S. Mill have been one of the biggest supporters of freedom of speech and expression. Okay. And J.S. Mill, in that sense, fought very much that people should be allowed the freedom, they should be allowed the right to speak, etc. And that is a very important aspect that he continuously emphasized on. Now, J.S. Mill also gave a harm principle. Okay. Now, after I explain to you harm principle, you know, sir, this I already know, but maybe the term you don't know. What is harm principle? Okay. Now, J.S. Mill simply said this regard, okay, that you are allowed to do whatever you want, but the condition is it should not harm the other person. So your freedom is unlimited, or I can say the freedom is limited only to the extent it does not harm the other person, right? And this is beautifully also explained in our Indian Constitution. In our Indian Constitution, we don't have things that are absolute. Yes or no? Freedom is never absolute. Even in your fundamental rights, which is there in the part 3 of the Indian Constitution, all of that in more detail we'll be seeing as we move along. Fundamental rights, please remember, are not absolute. They are limited, and they're limited by reasonable restrictions. The fundamental rights are limited by reasonable restrictions. Very important to understand. Okay. And these reasonable restrictions are similar to this concept which we have seen, J.S. Mill's harm principle, right? So when I'm looking at it, okay, the idea here is absolute freedom cannot exist in the society. As simple as that. Because absolute freedom will lead to harm in the society. And harm not just in terms of like people are fighting. For example, if there is a very tense situation, don't you see the police? They have a curfew that is getting imposed. If they allow the movement, there's very high chance there may be a riot. Yes, the movement can be restricted. Similarly, for example, if there is election in certain parts, you will see the movement getting restricted, etc. Yes or no? Similarly, if somebody is making very much inflammatory, passionate speeches, there is a restriction also put on these people. You cannot just publish anything that you write. In fact, even on social media now, if you're posting anything, the government can easily take down that particular maybe video or that particular tweet if it is anti-India, for example, if it is hurting the sentiments of a community. Yes or no? And you've also seen the same thing. Sometimes very popular OTT platform Netflix, if they have a show coming up, and if that show has some segment, even small segment, that is hurting maybe religious sentiments, any sentiments of a community, don't you see a protest and immediately some action is taken? Sometimes that portion is trimmed, somebody is asked to give an apology, right? In fact, I'll tell you about popular literary scholars like Salman Rushdie. Okay, his book very popular during that time and equally banned satanic verses. Okay, so the point is that was considered to be blasphemous by certain people, and it was, of course, this could have led to a lot of issues. Okay, so for a very long time that book was not available in the market. So the point to make and understand here is freedom is not absolute. Please write this line somewhere. Freedom is not absolute. What is the reason? Absolute freedom can harm the society. Very well explained by J.S. Mill that absolute freedom can harm the society. Right? Again, think of very simple thing. Around let's say close to localities, why do you think the DJ or the music, whenever there's a, let's say, wedding going on, beyond 10 p.m., you cannot play the loud music? To do so, the police will also say hi, yes or no? And if somebody does that, even in the midnight, if it is impacting everybody's sleep, police action can be taken on that, yes or no? So the main point to understand here is very simple. You have to understand, okay, two things. I'm writing two lines. There is no absolute freedom. Second, there are reasonable restrictions imposed. Reasonable restrictions are imposed. Also understand, these are the two basic things I wanted to tell you, right? Now, we are at the end of this chapter. Again, we are taking one chapter by chapter, very simple concepts. Even in this lecture, right, whatever concepts we have seen, let me just see the comment section also. Is there a doubt so far? Thanks a lot, Aditya. Okay, so here we understood what is freedom. One basic definition, but the social aspect of freedom, the contributions, let's say, of Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, and then what is negative. And in fact, we also saw why is freedom important, and then we also saw why there is a distinction between two things: negative and positive freedom, and freedom and social constraints. Here, very important thing was J.S. Mill's harm principle, right? To minimize the harm. Freedom cannot be absolute, which is also why we have reasonable restrictions, right? This we will do in far more detail in the polity classes in Article 19, right? Everything has a restriction because we have to maintain law and order, right? And imagine the state has to do both things, right? State has to balance freedom of people also, but at the same time it has to ensure law, liberty, right? Both things, law and order, has to be ensured, right? So this is where come to the end of this lecture. I hope you're getting benefit from it. People who are watching this, okay, you are more than welcome to please draw a comment also. It helps us also to know your feedback and also improve. Fine. So I'll take your leave now. We've done two chapters till now, chapter 1, chapter 2, right? Short chapters filled with concepts. Please spend time if you watch this, okay? Make very short notes. I think both in one page you would have done your chapter number 1, in one page you would have done chapter number 2, right? Now freedom is also linked with equality. That section I'll cover when I do equality, right? Chapter by chapter we are exploring concepts, okay? So now I'll meet you in the next chapter, okay? You'll get notifications in the channels that you would have joined in, okay? Thank you so much. And if you have any doubts, people online, etc., just drop a comment in the YouTube, we'll get to know, fine? That is there. Other than that, if somebody, for example, wants to know more, this is your NCERT AARAMBH course. Of course, we also have a full-fledged dedicated foundation course by the name of Kavach. If you want to know more details, you can please connect with the team, all right? Thank you.